Hi, I'm Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we're going to be discussing sponge cakes.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
On previous shows, we have talked about cakes containing fat using such methods as the creaming method or the one-stage method. If you remember my yellow cake layers or my chocolate cake layers, we talked about on previous shows, all these cakes had fat in them. Now, today we're going to be talking about sponge cakes. Sponge cakes are a little different. Cakes using lots of fat tend to be more tender, because the fat coats the gluten strands and prevents any major structure from developing, other than that the cake doesn't fall apart. But they tend to be tender cakes, and they fall apart easily. The cakes that we're talking about today, sponge cakes, are different in that they're not leavened with chemical leaveners. The chocolate cake and the yellow cake layers were leavened with baking powder and baking soda. And I did a show previously on chemical leaveners. But today's show's on sponge cakes, and we're not talking about chemical leaveners, really. We're talking about air being the leavening agent for these cakes. So these sponge cakes are like in a whole different realm. They're so interesting in that the egg holds air, the egg white holds air, and these batters will hold air and actually create structure. Sponge cakes are also not as crumbly and tender as cakes that are made with fat. And that's because egg proteins tend to be relatively, for lack of a better word, sort of rubbery when they're cooked. Picture an egg getting firm in a frying pan when you fry it. It has a lot more structure when it coagulates. So these cakes tend to be tougher than cakes high in fat. A layer of sponge cake actually can be cut horizontally into many layers, and it really won't break apart. It's sort of strange, but it won't. You can even get sponge cakes that are made in rectangular shapes that can be rolled. So you have what's known as a cake roll, right? Like a jelly roll, or a sponge cake that has whipped cream in the middle of it, or even ice cream cake rolls. Those are usually made with sponge cakes because you can roll them up and they won't break. It's uncanny, but it actually is true. Whenever I show students, they're like, oh, that's going to break. And it really stays together. You can actually roll up this layer of sponge cake. It's sort of cool. So a lot of European torts and cakes are made of sponge cake, or the sponge method of mixing. Remember, everything in baking has a method, a set order on how ingredients are to be mixed. You can't just throw them into a bowl and have it come together. There is a set way to mix things. And there are two basic categories of sponge cakes. We're going to go into each type, and we're going to go into the different types of each type. So there is the whole egg foam, or a whole egg sponge cake. So in this method, these particular sponge cakes use the entire egg. You don't have to separate any eggs, right? Some people don't like to separate eggs into the egg yolk and the egg white. So whole eggs and granulated sugar are warmed over a pot of simmering water and beaten using the whip attachment of the electric mixer until foamy and light. And what allows them to get foamy and light, even light in color, is there's a surface tension amongst egg parts and basically everything. And if you warm them up, the surface tension breaks and allows more air to be beaten into them. So that's why we do this. And warming these eggs will allow greater volume for our ultimate sponge cake. Then sifted dry ingredients, or whisked dry ingredients, are then folded into the egg foam using a rubber spatula. And some recipes for whole egg foams or whole egg sponge cakes use a small amount of melted butter, and that's quickly folded in at the end. This type of whole egg sponge cake is very well known as a genoise, and maybe you've heard of this type of cake. It's a French sponge cake, and it's used in many French-style torts, using this as a basis for this cake. So this cake can be made less dry because a lot of egg foam cakes are dry. Sugar syrups, flavored sugar syrups with liqueurs and vanilla or lemon or almond are basically brushed over each layer before it's frosted, either with a buttercream or have a layer of marzipan in the middle of it. So these are very rich torts, but they're used, and the basis of them is sponge cake, this whole egg sponge cake. So another category of sponge cakes that I want to talk about is the separated egg foam cake, right? There's a whole egg, and now there's a separated. So you get the drift. These are cakes that are different from the whole egg sponge in that the eggs are separated into the white and the yolk. So you really do have to separate your eggs before you start making this particular type of sponge cake. And you have to make sure that one doesn't mix with the other. So it's okay if a little white gets into the yolk. Is not okay if the yolk gets into the white. The yolk contains the fat of the egg. And if any of the yolk gets into that egg white, you will not be able to beat it up to its full volume. So remember that. So there's usually two different batters that are made, and then the heavier batter containing the yolks gets lightened by the foam made from the egg whites. We always, as bakers, always want to have the heavier batter on the bottom, and we want to put a light batter on the top. If you put a light batter on the bottom, all the air is going to get pushed out of it, right? So it makes sense that you put the light, airier one on the top. So here's a typical method for a separated egg foam cake. So egg yolks and only a small portion of the granulated sugar are beaten until thick and light. And usually this really gets to be very thick. Then egg whites are then beaten after the bowl is cleaned out, so you don't get any of the fat from the yolks in it. They're then beaten with the remainder of the granulated sugar to form stiff peaks. The beaten egg white foam is then folded into the sugar and yolk mixture, alternating with dry ingredients. And sometimes even cream of tartar is added to the egg foam to actually stabilize it more and give it a stronger texture. It doesn't help it get to be more voluminous. It just makes it a stronger egg foam. Now, I find this a little cumbersome to put the egg and the sugar in the yolk mixture and then alternate it with the dry ingredients. I find there's a better and easier method. And I have used this with great success with my students and myself. And I like to call it, I know, don't laugh, the Mr. Spock Method. Remember from Star Trek? Well, to paraphrase Mr. Spock, he said in different ways, but this is my way of remembering what he said. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? So a small portion of the egg foam, I'm going to sacrifice it and let all the air sort of come out of that, but to make it lighter so that the heavier batter containing the yolks will lighten and get a little more air filled. And then the remaining airier egg foam will actually leaven the cake by being folded in. So this is how this works. This is how I do it. I whisk the dry ingredients into the yolks, and that batter is going to be so thick, it's going to barely be mixable. And it's going to be very yellow. Remember, your yolks are in there. I then whisk in 1/3 of the beaten egg foam to lighten the batter. I whisk it in. If you whisk in an egg foam and not fold it in with a rubber spatula, you're going to lose a lot of that air bubble. You're going to lose a lot of that leavening from the egg foam if you whisk it in. But that's where the needs of the few are going to be sacrificed. So that 1/3 of egg foam is going to lose. It's going to be treated very roughly by the whisk, but it's going to lighten that yolked batter, that batter with the yolks in it because it was so heavy. And then ultimately, the remaining egg foam will now be able to be incorporated much more easily and create even a fluffier batter. I find the dry ingredients get incorporated much more efficiently this way. So that's my way of doing it. And I end up with higher cakes. They rise higher, they're lighter, and they have a little bit a better texture to them. So another separated egg foam that we all love is the angel food cake, right? Angel food. How many of you have ever had an angel food cake recently? You can buy them in the grocery store, but they're never half as high as what you could get at home. So angel food cakes are pure white, and that's why they're named angel food cakes, because they look like angels, they're white, and they only contain the egg whites. They don't contain any yolks whatsoever. So I remember them being referred to as the low-fat cake. They have no fat in them. There's no yolks, and the yolk has the fat of the egg, and they have a lot of sugar, and they have a lot of whites. Sometimes you can need up to a dozen whites to make an angel food cake. So the yolks can be saved. You don't want to throw your yolks out, but this may be a good time to listen to my ice cream show and use your yolks to make a custard, or making a stovetop custard without a starch or even with a starch, because you can use a lot of these yolks for those recipes. So in the angel food method, it's a specific method. The flour is whisked or sifted with half the sugar, and then you set it aside. Room temperature egg whites are beaten until foamy, and then cream of tartar is added here to stabilize, remember, cream of tartar is an acid. Acids can denature proteins in your egg whites and get them a little firmer. This will stabilize it so that it will create a stronger meringue. It is beaten until soft peaks form, and then the remaining granulated sugar is added slowly. You want to add it about a tablespoon at a time, the sugar, and then the whites are beaten to stiff peaks. Now the egg foam or the meringue is placed into a very large bowl. Don't do the mixing in your electric mixing bowl. There's not enough room. Put it into a large bowl. Yes, you have to wash an extra bowl, but it's okay. The results will be worth it, trust me. Add the reserved flour and sugar mixture on top of your egg foam and fold them in with a rubber spatula until you don't see them anymore. And then the whole thing is put into a tube pan. So traditionally, angel food cakes are baked in a tube pan, and it's left ungreased. Don't grease it. Don't spray it with nonstick cooking spray. Don't flour it. You need it ungreased. So that's the way you make an angel food cake. Now, there's one last sponge cake type that I want to go into that is a separated egg foam. That is known as the chiffon cake, and it uses what's known as the chiffon method. There's so many methods here, right? Chiffon cakes are the exception to all sponge cakes. Now, the one reason they're an exception is that they have some baking powder in them. Did I say baking powder? Baking powder, yes. They have a chemical leavener in them. And I said there are no chemical leaveners in sponge cakes, but this is an exception. And they even have a little oil in them. So it's sort of like cheating, because you get a little leavening help from the chemical leavener baking powder, and the oil makes the cake even more tender and gives a lighter crumb. So if you have never made a sponge cake, I would start with a chiffon cake. It's great practice. And you will see what you can do with a separated egg sponge cake. Fabulous. So this is the procedure. The dry ingredients, which include some baking powder and a portion of the sugar, are whisked into a bowl. Now, if you notice there's a theme here, there's always only portion of the sugar is whisked in to the dry ingredients. That's because the remaining sugar is always put into the egg whites to make a meringue. So you'll always save a portion of your sugar to be added to those egg whites. So once your dry ingredients with a portion of the sugar are whisked together into a bowl, you're going to add oil, the egg yolks, water, or maybe some other water-based ingredient, and any flavorings. You're going to mix them right in with the dry ingredients, and it's going to make sort of a loose batter. Now, in an electric mixing bowl, the egg whites are beaten with cream of tartar, again to stabilize, and the remaining sugar to create a foam, and then they're beaten to stiff peaks. and make sure you get to stiff peaks. The whites are then folded into the flour mixture and placed into a tube pan to be baked. Again, ungreased tube pan. Now, if the sponge cake is ever baked as a layer cake, every type of sponge cake that I mentioned, if it's baked as a layer cake, you can bake it as a layer cake. They're rarely baked as layer cakes, but you can, like a genoise is a layer cake typically. But angel food, chiffon are typically tube cakes, and they're used tube pans, and they're never greased or floured. And the reason, so why aren't they greased or floured? This way the batter can climb up the sides of the pan as it rises. And after baking, the cake is actually allowed to cool upside down. Just like a bat hangs upside down, it hangs upside down and it won't sink or collapse. Gravity keeps it. If it's upside down, gravity will pull it down so it maintains its height from how it raised in the oven. Now you'll notice there are many tube pans on the market. Some of them, and most, a good tube pan will have pieces of metal sticking out known as tabs, and they will hold the pan up off the countertop because you don't want your lovely, beautifully raised chiffon cake or sponge cake or angel food cake to touch the countertop as it's cooling upside down. So some of these tube pans, they should have tabs. Don't buy one without a tab. Some should also be false bottomed. Just like you would make a cheesecake in a springform pan that's false bottomed. These false bottom ones are very easy to get the cake out afterwards. So if you can get a false bottom one, you're in the money. That's fabulous to do. And they're not that expensive. I would invest in one if you could. You allow the cake to hang upside down. And if it doesn't have tabs or it's not raising it as high as you'd like, you can put the tube part either onto a can to hold it off your countertop, or even some people take a wine bottle, a wine bottle with it's got that narrow tubey part of the wine bottle, the top of the wine bottle, and put the tube upside down through the top of the wine bottle and let it hang upside down. And let it hang until it's fully cooled down. And then you put it right side up, cut around the outside. Remember, it's not been greased, so it will take a little bit of a fight to get it out, but it won't be that hard. And then you just pop it out. But if you want any more information on egg foams and meringues, really listen to my previous show on egg foams. It's really something that you'll find super helpful in making sponge cakes in general. So if you've enjoyed the episode today, hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to leave a review, I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, head on over to bakingradio.com and leave me a message. I would love to answer some of your questions on air. And next week's show, we're going to be talking about chiffon cake.